Okay. Thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me here today. It's such a privilege to be in this amazing structure with its visceral connections to nature outside, which is very apt in terms of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about some of the themes that underpin our work as a practicing landscape architects, but also going to talk primarily about a piece of research we've been doing called Urban Mind. So, everything is connected. The design of beautiful urban landscapes of quality and imagination have the potential to provide transformative benefits to health and well-being. But many people have lost their connection to the environment and nature around them. The impacts of climate change are undeniable, and our response to it glacial. As urban populations explode and intensify, centralizing resource demand and dispersing resource production, access to nature becomes fundamental to our mental and physical well-being. Concepts of rewilding, land restoration, safeguarding urban habitats, and habitat creation are gathering renewed momentum, while simultaneously revenue funding for public realm and landscapes is diminishing at an alarming rate. There are several fundamental components of critical infrastructure that are key to every project that we work on, and collectively they require us to better appreciate the web of life, how everything hangs together in the balanced nature of nature, and fundamentally with people as part of the ecosystem. So, when I talk about critical infrastructure, I'm talking about living infrastructure. Soils, in this case, directly provide the vast majority of our food. They are also the largest store of carbon in the Earth's system. They regulate water quality and quantity, reducing the risks of floods, droughts, and pollution. And this is how we treat most of our soils in urban locations. Flora. London is home to roughly the same number of trees as it is the population, just over 8 million. However, the tree canopy is under extreme pressure from underground services, emerging diseases, and development pressures. Many of our street trees are of a similar age, and there are no new citywide programs to replenish the tree stock. And then water. The natural system has been disrupted. Historically, we've imposed the city on the natural environment. We urgently need to find solutions that work with this process symbiotically. When water as critical infrastructure is a variable condition and usually is only deemed newsworthy when there is either too much or too little. And we believe landscape architects are ideally placed to mediate between these topics and these scales, to innovate in the fields of public realm, environment, well-being, and green infrastructure. The ability of the landscape architect to draw on knowledge from arts, humanities, and sciences, and to champion a project from the inception through to its delivery, and then its ongoing management and maintenance, is critical. Landscape architects also have a unique ability to engage and empower urban communities to take responsibility for their own environment. But collectively, we must grab the mantle as built environment professionals. And when we collaborate with experts in other fields, such as artists, neuroscientists, and technologists, the potential for positive change grows exponentially. This leads on to our collaborative research project, Urban Mind. This project was conceived with neuroscientist Professor Andrea McKelly of King's College London and Michael Smythe of Arts Foundation Nomad Projects. Existing evidence on beneficial effects of nature and mental health largely comes from studies using cross-sectional designs. In medical research, this places the focus on whole population trends rather than individual responses or site-specific interactions. When we began our pilot back in 2015, we set out to develop a new prototype for cross-disciplinary research across the boundaries of practice and academia, but crucially delivered by citizen scientists. One of the core principles of our study has always been to make the results of the data analysis freely available. on open source platforms where appropriate. We also feel this sort of research should be implicitly generous. The sharing of this knowledge is possible due to the rigorous ethical process the research is subject to, the anonymity of the participants, and crucially, the absence of any commercial imperative. The Urban Mind smartphone tool is used to help to examine the impact of the surrounding built environment on the mental well-being of people as they go about their daily lives. It uses a methodology known as ecological momentary assessment, which involves repeated sampling of an individual's current experiences in real time and real-world contexts over the period of 2 weeks. I'm being told to slow down. As an example, the following images are a snapshot of my walk to work and provide a sample of the questions that participants are prompted to respond to during an assessment. I'm lucky that nature is ever present during my journey, even if it's not necessarily a designed intervention, or what you might consider from your own point of view, a quality intervention. But what this does illustrate is that as a snapshot, the benefits of little and frequent contact with nature, or as it's often referred to, bio-dosing. So you can see the questions at the bottom that we're prompting people to think about in terms of the responses they give on their phone. And it's thinking about, I'm obviously taking these pictures from the perspective of a landscape architect, but what's quite interesting is when you get members of the public responding in this sense, we have this issue of plant blindness. So people will walk past trees, not necessarily registering that they in fact have nature on their doorstep. And then these images highlight a phenomenon that's happening in London, particularly the one on the left and one on the right, which seems to be a process of chopping down trees at waist height and then not replacing them. It's kind of curious. Or indeed taking them out entirely, as the second image shows, again not replacing them. So, the ecological momentary assessment has 3 significant benefits. It allows multiple measurements over time, providing insight into dynamic changes in mental states that could not be captured by a single snapshot. It allows the acquisition of detailed information on the type and amount of nature that people experience, either incidentally or intentionally. And it maximizes ecological validity, as data is collected in real-world environments, without the issues that recall bias can often have in studies that take the person back into a classroom environment and ask the questions there. Each time a participant completes an assessment, they were also invited to collect and submit a photograph of the ground and an audio recording of the surrounding environment. We are particularly interested in how we might feed back our research to members of the public. So audio and visual is something that we're experimenting with in terms of that process. And during the pilot, we used the data to test 3 related hypotheses. The first was that exposure to natural features, including trees, the sky, birdsong, and water, would be associated with higher levels of momentary mental well-being. The second was that these effects would still be evident in subsequent assessments, in which people are no longer exposed to trees, the sky, birdsong, water, etc., indicating that there is a time-lasting benefit with contact with nature. And the third was that these effects would be more evident in people with higher trait impulsivity. People with higher trait impulsivity are known to be at a greater vulnerability to mental health issues than those with lower trait impulsivity. Now, all of these hypotheses were proved as a result of the pilot study, and they provide robust empirical evidence to support the notion that short-term exposure to specific natural features has measurable benefits on mental well-being. One of the most profound results was that these beneficial effects could be observed even if the participant was no longer outdoors and no longer had access to nature. This lagged effect indicates a time-lasting impact of nature on mental well-being that can still be observed after several hours. So our pilot study was conceived as a London-specific study, but it quickly spread globally. The ability to geotag data and then to combine it with other data sets opens up many avenues for site-specific investigation across all stages of a project, from feasibility to post-occupancy review. It also allows us to cross-reference responses from different global locations where the pressures on development are radically different. Crucially, the ability to geo-reference participant data allows us to cross-reference existing and emerging data sets from other sectors. We're also able to keep a track of global trends in terms of participation in real time. Each one of these dots is a kind of, the larger the dot, greater concentration of participants at any one time. You can get the most up-to-date data from this on our website, urbanmind.info. So from the perspective of urban planning and design, the data provides a much-needed evidence base to inform future investment and policies. In particular, our findings suggest that greater access to natural features within the built environment can be especially beneficial to those individuals mentioned who might be at greater risk of developing mental health issues. But also from the perspective of mental health itself, the data can inform the development of low-cost, scalable interventions aimed at promoting mental health in urban populations. This is an urgent global health priority because mental illness is the leading cause of disability worldwide. So we're very used to using data sets in our work. This image is from the All London Green Grid, which is the green infrastructure strategy for London. You'll see from it that London is approximately 47% green space. In this diagram, the variations in colour represent different typologies of open space, including regional parks down to what you might call a pocket park on your doorstep. However, as this diagram illustrates, the issue is not quantity, but rather about access. Large areas of open space in London are private. The darker pink areas in this drawing identify where access to open space is limited. In the case of central London, you might be able to pick out the Serpentine Lake and Hyde Park. So obviously the larger spaces are offering a really valuable resource. But there's an intensity of pink around there which suggests that there are very few small local public parks or spaces for people on their doorstep. What is critical when looking at drawings like this is that these types of metrics are purely quantitative and not qualitative. In fact, this data set predates the invention of the smartphone. But what might be possible with more dynamic data gathering is the potential for something like this, a dynamic map of well-being in a city like London, which helps focus investment and maximizes positive change. So I'm going to quickly talk about a specific project which highlights the potential we see for this sort of research. And I'd just like to highlight that as well, that we don't see Urban Mind or this research as a new way of designing cities. We see it as a complementary way to support the work that we already do. Our project Making Space in Dalston in East London is a rich example of green infrastructure at a local scale with hyperlocal and site-specific interventions. Here impact is related to the place rather than physical size or capital cost. It is not about a copy and paste solution. We developed our own brief with our collaborators Muff Architecture Art for our client, the Mayor of London. The intention was to create a series of new public realm and open space enhancements. But how do you do this in a dense neighbourhood where underused space is at a premium? We realised very quickly that a distinct typology was necessary. A series of micro-interventions that could make real impact locally where the need was greatest. Collectively, these projects deliver a wide-reaching transformative impact on well-being for local residents supported by cultural, social and environmental programs. 3 principles emerged from our research and dialogue process with local stakeholders and the local community. The first was to value what's there. The second was to then nurture what was possible. And then, only then, did we try and define what was missing and come up with solutions in terms of new interventions. And it goes back to a point that was made earlier, that quite often the best approach is not necessarily to add, but to edit. And what was just as important as the physical intervention during this project was the process of engagement, delivery, and aftercare. The largest of our micro-interventions was the Dalston Eastern Curve Garden, at 0.2 hectares, quite small, and located on a former piece of abandoned railway land. What's interesting now is that this place has more visitors per square metre than all of the London Royal Parks combined. It's an intensity of use that's quite phenomenal. And what was critical to the success of this place was the involvement of local stakeholders to create a robust management structure for the garden to grow and thrive. And the biggest obstacle to overcome was actually that of a perception. How can we convince those who are funding this project and own the land that a piece of landscape that formerly had negative connotations could be transformed into a positive addition to the local public realm? In retrospect, robust mental well-being data such as that the Urban Mind project generates would have helped irrefutably reinforce what we already knew instinctively. So our concept was to maintain a sense of surprise and delight, a garden hidden behind a hoarding, built by local people who would learn skills during that process, and ultimately that would create a space that would be managed by local people and volunteers. This is a view of the queue during the annual Halloween Pumpkin Carving Festival, so quite a recent activity. And what's really important about this is that the fact there's a program of events that keeps this place vibrant and relevant. It's not about stopping, it's all about allowing a place to be continually reinventing its program. And to conclude, Urban Mind has recently been used in clinical trials within the National Health Service in London. There's a specific version of the app in that context that's being used as an interventionist tool. And then exciting news for us and hopefully for you is that we are relaunching Urban Mind at the end of this year. We now have it in 7 different languages and the ability to update into any language that potential partners might be interested in. And we've also restructured it in a way where we have thematic groupings of questions. So if a particular partner comes forward, we can focus the research to test the questions and hypotheses that those partners are most interested in. With that in mind, if anyone's interested, please do get in touch. I'll be here later, but we have a website where you can find more information. And then coming back to this whole point that we were hearing about in the previous session, how do we involve the public? So we've been thinking about ways of creating public experts. So we don't see any distinction necessarily between people who have trained. When we're looking at neighbourhoods, the people who live there are the experts about that within that neighbourhood. So we are developing a toolkit to create well-being ambassadors. So we have the app-based activities, then we have the on-the-ground workshops. And I think that's particularly interesting in terms of the discussions we've had about vocabulary. Because I've learned a new vocabulary, which is more about neuroscience and well-being. Similarly, my colleagues at King's College have learned a new vocabulary about urban planning and landscape. And we're keen that that is something that's actually transferable to the general public as well, so they can talk with some knowledge about mental health, because there's often a stigma around that, and we need to overcome that. Thank you very much.